Maiden Castle, one of the largest and most impressive hill forts in Britain. More than 2,000 years ago, this was a great communal centre that dominated the surrounding landscape. A mighty symbol of power and authority, an icon of Iron Age Britain. To learn more about this ancient bastion, I'm teaming up with archaeologist Dr. Miles Russell.
Miles, just to be up here, I've never been up here before, but it's such a massive space, isn't it? This must be one of the largest hill forts, not just in Britain, but in the whole of Europe.
It is, yes, it's immense. You've got 4 sets of banks and ditches rising up in front of you. So as far as engineering projects go from prehistory, it's one of the largest.
Because it's not just this big plain in the centre, isn't it? It's all of these layers and layers of ramparts too.
Actually, yes, spreading right the way out like sort of ripples as a stone hits the water, spreading out in all directions.
Set the scene. Whereabouts in Britain are we talking with Maiden Castle, and describe the topography to us?
Well, we're right down on the south coast, right smack in the middle of Dorset. The county town of Dorchester is just over there, so the sea is just to the south of us in that direction. We're on top of the chalk, and it's still a very sort of fantastic rural setting, really. There's been no major development as far as roads or sort of transport infrastructure around here. So the landscape that we're looking at now wouldn't have been that dissimilar to when the Hillfort was built in the Iron Age.
And because of its position, do you think that's why we seem to have thousands of years of occupation here deep into our prehistory?
Yeah, exactly, yes. I mean, the first people came here at the beginning of the Neolithic, so the first farming communities in about 4000 BC were building an enclosure here. And right the way from there up until really the arrival of the Romans in the 1st century AD, people are inhabiting this space and modifying it. So it's one continuous building project really for about 4 millennia.
The first people occupied Maiden Castle in around 4000 BC, at the start of an incredibly important period in human prehistory, the Neolithic or New Stone Age, when the people based around here abandoned their preceding hunter-gatherer lifestyle and adopted a more sedentary one. The people here became farmers.
Do you have any evidence? Do we know where exactly these farmers would have lived in this, well, on top of Maiden Castle?
Well, yes, the rampart that we can see just about behind us there, that's actually early Iron Age. So that dates to about 800 BC. But underneath that and just in front of it, there is a Neolithic causewayed enclosure. So that Iron Age earthwork is built directly on top of a much earlier setting. So we can imagine in about 4000 BC, creating an enclosure and saying, this is mine, keep out, is something radically new. It's very different. This idea of owning the land. We don't see it in any time before in the Mesolithic and the Paleolithic with hunter-gatherer groups. But to dig a ditch and a bank and define a space and say this is mine, that is radically different. So in 4000 BC, the first farmers are really altering the landscape and modifying it to their own ends.
It's absolutely fascinating to think, isn't it, Miles? So Stonehenge constructed roughly around 3000 BC, around that time?
Yeah, I mean, the Stone Age is all really about modifying the land. It's about creating monuments. And that enclosure there is one of the earliest ones in the country.
And so as the Neolithic period progresses, do we see the enclosure, the people who lived here? Do you have any idea as to whether the whole settlement, does it expand, does it increase? What do we know as we get towards the Bronze Age?
We know that this particular enclosure seems to only really last about 500 years or so. There is some evidence of burning. We know that a number of enclosures around this part of the country seem to either been attacked or they're deliberately slighted and demolished. And then as we move on into the Bronze Age, there are little settlements all the way around here, fairly small scale farming communities. Pretty much where Dorchester is today, there are a series of smaller stone circles, there's large post circles, there's a series of monumental henge monuments there, which all seem to be some kind of ritual site. So there's a religious ceremonial series of sites, and associated with that is a large number of round barrows, some of which still survive nicely in the landscape today. The trouble is most of this landscape's been intensively ploughed over the last 200 years, so the less substantial earthworks have gone and we're left with the more monumental round barrows.
So that's so interesting. So we definitely see evidence, monumental evidence of Bronze Age activity around this area, but do we have much evidence for Bronze Age activity on the castle, on the hill itself?
Not really, no. There's a slight trace. There might have been one or two round barrows up here that were levelled during the Iron Age, but something curious is drawing people to this landscape in throughout the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. We don't know why this area was important, but it evidently was, and people are creating these large earthwork enclosures, for about 2,000 years.
Well, you mentioned the Iron Age, and you said early Iron Age, so around 800 BC. Is this the beginning of when Maiden Castle, it starts to become the Maiden Castle that we can see the remains of so vividly today, the start of its golden age?
It is. So the earliest Hillfort is directly on top of the Neolithic enclosure. So that we can see is about 800 BC.
Yep.
But then from about 400 BC, it's massively expanded and it goes to take up the whole of the chalk hill. So we get this huge engineering activity. And really, as we go around, you can see that these ramparts are part of that later monumental phase.
Well, Miles, you mentioned those ramparts. I can see some stunning ones down there. Let's go and have a look at those.
These ramparts and ditches are what make Maiden Castle really special. Visually, they are stunning, constructed during the early to mid-Iron Age, roughly between 800 and 300 BC.
And this is not even how the Iron Age ditch would have looked like in its prime. It would have been even deeper.
Yeah, and they look impressive today, and quite rightly so, but bear in mind that this has been slumping for over 2,000 years, so the ditch is probably a good 6 or 7 metres deeper. The ramparts might be 6 metres higher, and then originally on the top of the ramparts you've had a wooden palisade. So it would have looked a really intimidating sight in the Iron Age. I mean, it's intimidating now, but it's so much more impressive when it was being created. And the ramparts, of course, are dug out of chalk, so these big gleaming white walls up against the sort of green grass background.
And do you think it's also that visual impressiveness of it at the same time, as you mentioned, that chalk white combined with a palisade at the top, just to be seen from a distance, how impressive this emphasis on power and might of the people who oversaw its construction?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely changed the landscape here. So, if you think of it more like a lighthouse in the landscape, it's standing out, it's dominating. It would look just so impressive. You'd realise that anyone living in here or inhabiting here is someone of immense power.
Could perhaps the main purpose of building this massive rampart and ditch have been for the chieftain based here, if it was a chieftain, to emphasise their power, to emphasise that they were at the top?
I think so, yeah. I mean, this is a place where people are coming to. It's a communal place. It's a place where resources are centred. I mean, the trouble is we look at this today and we think of defence and warfare in a modern sense. There's no standing armies in the Iron Age. You've got farmers, you've got small numbers of warriors. So there's nothing really that's capable of taking a site like this. So this is all about dominating and it's all about being impressive. And you think about the levels of organisation it would take to get people to dig this out with bone and stone and metal tools. So perhaps over many, many generations, people were being born, working here, dying here without ever seeing it finished. So it is marshalling the resources from this vast block of Dorset on this one spot for many, many generations to get this built.
The amount of time and effort needed to construct these massive ditches and ramparts some 2,500 years ago is extraordinary. But Maiden Castle didn't just consist of these monumental palisade-tipped earthworks in the Iron Age. The Great Central Plain was home to an entire settlement too.
Tessa and Mortimer Wheeler, sort of their husband and wife team, really you could argue the mother and father of modern British archaeology. They came here in 1934 to excavate what they thought was an Iron Age town and to find evidence of a possible Roman attack because they knew that the Romans were coming through here in about AD 43. So they were very much focused on trying to understand the end of the Hillfort. But the excavations that they conducted in the interior, they found large numbers of round houses, they found storage facilities, as well as just cutting through the banks and ditches. So their work was really the first to identify the fact that there is a large settlement within here. You may have anything between 1,000 and 2,000 people living up here at its height in the Iron Age. So you think of this as a town. It's got storage, it's got manufacturing areas, there's elite settlement, there's religious focus. It's got all the elements of a town.
Because when you think about the inside of Maiden Castle, the top of Maiden Castle today, it's just a big grassy plain. But more than 2,000 years ago, this would have been full of Iron Age houses, I'm presuming the iconic roundhouse.
Yes, I mean, the excavations in the 30s and also Neil Sharple's work here in the 1980s uncovered a large numbers of roundhouses. So essentially sort of timber structures with a nice thatched conical roof over the top. The geophysical surveys that we've done across here as well to map the whole of the interior, it looks like you've got hundreds of roundhouses. We can never be sure whether they're all occupied at the same time, but you've got these roadways that come out from the entrance, and you've got almost like sort of Iron Age suburbia. You've got the roundhouses dotted along these roadways. There's storage facilities behind. So the level of organisation for the settlement itself is significant. I mean, today it's just this vast expanse of green being gnawed at by sheep, but it's difficult to visualise this as thousands of people in their roundhouses with their storage, with their granaries, all occupying this space.
And it's fascinating because we sometimes think of the Romans, they bring roads, they bring urbanism, they bring towns, but actually the archaeology, the evidence from Maiden Castle, it's showing how the people who lived here, there's town planning. This is a proto-town here.
I think we just always get blinded by the fact that the Greeks and Romans have what we would recognise more as a town, with that sort of level of sort of social organisation in the interior. But the Britons, the Gauls, the Germans, people in northwestern Europe, they've been creating towns for millennia beforehand. This has got all the elements of a town to it. The Romans wouldn't have recognised it in the same way, the kind of urban structures that they were building. But yeah, this is your Iron Age town.
It also begs the all-important question, Miles. The people, the amount of people it would have taken to build this rampart, this ditch, the people who were living there. Do we know who these Iron Age people were?
We don't.
There we go.
We know in the late Iron Age, after this Hillfort's gone out of use, that the name of the tribe that occupied this space were the Durotriges. They were the ones that came into contact with the Romans in the 1st century AD. As far as we can see, they are not occupying this Hillfort. So whoever's building this, we don't know. We don't know what they were called. We've got no idea of their social organisation at all. Presumably it is some individual or group of individuals, men and women, who are somehow ordering this to be built and designing it. But who they were, archaeology doesn't give us that information, and they weren't writing anything down. So effectively, their stories are lost to us.
For now.
For now.
The archaeology hasn't given you it yet, but who knows in the future. I mean, just keeping on those ramparts a bit, how they managed to get up to the top. What do we know about the entranceways themselves?
The entranceways are extremely complicated. I mean, you've really got to walk through them to understand them.
And so let's go and have a look at it. Nice day, isn't it, when the sun comes out?
It's beautiful.
Behind the clouds.
Yeah, you get that sort of contrast when it's all grey.
So Miles, this is one of the modern entranceways to the castle, but at the same time, this was also one of the Iron Age entranceways too.
It was, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's the main way in and out at the western end of the Hillfort.
And so how should we imagine this entranceway looking more than 2,000 years ago?
Well, it'd be a lot more impressive than today, because the rampart would be another sort of 3 or 4 metres higher, and then a timber palisade on top of that, then a large gateway with a tower either side, and then timber gates closed shut. So it's a real barrier, a real attempt to seal this weak point. But the whole idea of this as having multiple earthworks, multiple ditches, is to confuse an enemy. I guess anyone who's not used to the main approach would be drawn down sort of fake or pretend entrance points effectively into killing zones. I mean, we know that the major sort of Iron Age weapon of choice is the slingshot.
Really?
So when excavations of the 1930s, they found quite a lot of these water-worn pebbles, probably coming from Chesil Beach, just down on the coast. And so the idea is to make entrance as difficult as possible. You're drawing people out and making them walk and backwards and forwards and running into different areas. It makes them targets for anyone up the top, hurling sling stones down. Of course, one of these pebbles striking you at speed across the skull is going to be a rather intimidating thing, and an effective weapon as well. So that's really what we're seeing here is this really complex series of earthworks designed to slow down a potential attack.
I mean, that's so fascinating. So they have found evidence of fighting here at Maiden Castle, and it begs the question, if you mentioned mid-Iron Age, so before the Romans, Is this evidence of Hillfort's warfare?
Well, they've certainly had evidence of preparation for fighting. We don't really know whether this Hillfort was attacked, and if so, by whom. There's no obvious evidence that the ramparts have been destroyed or burnt. What we have found, or what was found in the 1930s at the other entrance at the eastern side, was a series of burials, about 50 burials Mortimer Wheeler found in the last seasons in 1936, which have shown evidence of massive cranial trauma, so injuries to the top of the head, to the side and to the shoulders, which he thought at the time was evidence of a Roman assault. Because one of the reasons why he and Tess first came to this site was to try and find material evidence of the Second Legion Augusta, who were part of Rome's initial invasion, marching westwards. He felt they would have attacked these hill forts and therefore was looking for signs of an assault. The burials that he located in the east entrance, he felt, were clear signs that the Second Legion had stormed the hill fort and had massacred the population inside, and they'd been buried pretty much where they died.
And what's the story behind the one skeleton amongst these warriors who seems to have had a ballista bolt in his skeleton?
Yeah, I mean, Mortimer Wheeler, he'd served as an artillery officer in the First World War, so he understood the importance of sort of barrages and artillery attacks upon an enemy position. And when he found what he thought was a ballista bolt, an iron-tipped spearhead, fired from a catapult, a bolt-throwing weapon, he felt the Romans had somehow been firing these, showering down upon the east gate to disperse the enemy, to disperse the Iron Age Britons, and then they'd attacked the entranceway and slaughtered everybody within. Now, certainly there is an iron projectile embedded in the spine of one such skeleton. You can still see him in Dorchester Museum today, but it's not something fired from a Roman catapult. It is actually an Iron Age spearhead. So it's evidence that that individual died violently, possibly in single combat, but the radiocarbon dates suggest that these individuals are dying some time before the Romans.
The Romans invaded Britain in 43 AD, and as part of the initial conquest, one legion, the two Augusta, marched southwest towards the West Country, passing great hill forts along the way, such as Maiden Castle.
When the Romans do reach this area of Britain around 43 AD, the likes of Vespasian and the two Augusta, what do you think they encountered when they reached here, when they reached Maiden Castle?
Well, that's the question. Neil Sharple's excavations in the 1980s suggested that the hill fort's actually being abandoned by about 100 BC. So almost a century and a half before the Romans arrive. The big settlement with all the roundhouses and the road systems, that's decaying, that's on its way out. When the Romans arrived, there's probably only a small number of people up here. Our geophysical surveys picked up the evidence of what appears to be a late Iron Age farmstead, smack in the middle. So there may only have been 20, 30 people living up here, and probably more sort of down in the valleys around. So the Romans, when they arrived, Maiden Castle would have looked not dissimilar to it does to us today, ramparts, earth covered, no sign of a palisade, and certainly not a state-of-the-art defended fortification which they needed to attack.
That's interesting. So we think the palisade is already gone by that time too?
Almost certainly, yes. So it's all decayed, and really people are just living up here on this high point. We know they're metalworking, they're doing other range of activities, but it's by no means a large defended town.
It's fascinating. Do we have any idea why this hill fort is abandoned in the mid to late Iron Age, or we just see that it does eventually disappear?
There's a real event horizon about 100 BC where all the hill forts seem to be going out of use. So the political structures that called him into being are dying out. What that is, we don't know, but there is a real sea change in the way in which society is organised. It may be that there's no longer a desire, there's less competition about land ownership. It may be you've got less sort of powerful individuals with their own little private sort of warrior bands. But from 100 BC onwards, what we're seeing is a landscape dotted with little farmsteads. They've got small earthworks around them really just to protect their cattle, but they're by no means defended. So as we're going into the later Iron Age, just before the Romans arrive, it feels like this is a less scary landscape to inhabit. There's no need to be living on the hills behind 4 sets of bank and ditch.
Oh, interesting. So when the Romans do arrive, there's absolutely no need for them whatsoever to attack this place?
No, not at all.
But they do ultimately return here, don't they?
They do indeed.
So let's go and have a look at that.
The Romans never built their own settlement on top of Maiden Castle, opting instead for the nearby area below, what is today Dorchester. But they still left their mark atop this abandoned hill fort. in the form of this.
More than a grassy plain in Maiden Castle. I can see this is the remains of ancient buildings.
Yes, we are standing in the entranceway of a late Roman temple complex. So this doesn't actually relate to anything to do with the settlement of the Hillfort. This has been created at a much later date when the Roman town of Dorchester has already been in existence for about 300 years.
So that's so interesting. So as you say, this is hundreds and hundreds of years after the Hillfort here has been abandoned.
And I think that's the point, because the Hillfort sits as an abandoned set of earthworks on the immediate horizon. So for the people living in Dorchester, it's always there. It's a continual presence, perhaps reminding them of their ancestors, or for people who lived here, much, much earlier. And so this is a religious building on the highest point in the landscape. If you believe the gods are up in the clouds, this is as close as you can get to them, and it's in a much earlier prehistoric settlement. So it makes sense to perhaps to honour the gods and goddesses of the hill, of the tribe, of the community, whilst also getting as close as you can to the sky.
Absolutely, and I can see the layout, almost the outline of this ancient structure here now, this Romano-Celtic temple. Talk to me about its layout. So where are we now? What's this square we got in front of us here?
So the square in front of us is really the inner room, the inner sanctum. It's known as the Keller. If you'd come up here as a pilgrim from Dorchester to the temple, you would not be allowed inside that space. That is where the statue of the god or goddess resides. So presumably there's a priest or priestess who lives here. There's a series of rooms going off in that direction, who would see you coming some significant distance. You would be coming up here to make an offering, to make a sacrifice, possibly giving the life of an animal, possibly carrying something of material wealth to yourself as an offering to the gods, to make your prayer more significant.
It is really interesting because you mentioned the deity. The shape of this temple, I'm not imagining big Ionic or Doric columns at the front, a very Roman looking temple. If it's a Romano-Celtic hybrid kind of structure, do we know what sort of deity would have been worshipped? Are we thinking of some sort of mix between a local British god and a Roman god?
It's almost certainly a mix. I mean, the Romans were very good. They were extremely tolerant of other faith systems. The only times they had problems was when they come up against societies who believed in one god. If you believe in one god, you can't be assimilated into the Roman system. But the Romans have got gods for everything. Gods for sort of mosaics, for walls, for rivers, for every single aspect of life. And so have the ancient Britons. So the Romans coming here would map their gods onto the Iron Age ones. So you could carry on worshipping whatever deity you believed in, but a more Romanized version of that. And of course, the classic example is at Bath, where you've got the hot springs bubbling up. We know that the Iron Age goddess there is Sulis, the goddess of healing. The Romans mapped their goddess of healing and springs and wisdom, Minerva, to create Sulis Minerva. So you've got a super deity, part Iron Age British, part Roman. And I suspect whoever's being worshipped here is exactly the same.
It's amazing to think what archaeology lies beneath our feet right now that could potentially give us more information about who exactly would have been worshipped here and who came here to honour the particular deity.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's interesting to think that it's people coming from Dorchester's just down there.
Yes,
so this is on the horizon. So, if you're perhaps wanting something in your life, you're wanting a better career, you're wanting to have more success in love or something, you're making a prayer to the goddess here, or the god. You're walking, spending the best part of your day, climbing up this hill with your goat or with your gold coins. But this becomes the most important part of your life. You've got to make sure that whatever you bring up here, the deity is going to accept it.
Do we know why they decided to build the temple here, of all places?
We know most Romano-Celtic temples, like this one created in the 4th century AD, they're built on earlier religious buildings. So excavations here have revealed that there is an earlier structure beneath it, but not enough was exposed to really get a clear idea. But other temple buildings like this excavated around Britain, there is an Iron Age or very early Roman shrine directly underneath. So this is the final monumental phase of a much earlier religion. So this is probably a religious activity have been going on up here for hundreds of years.
Miles, it's absolutely fascinating to think, because we started chatting all about the Neolithic, the first farmers, the first real settlers here in the area who were living in these farmsteads, not moving around, hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And now we're here at the end of the Roman period. We've got constructions like this, it really gives you an insight into the legacy of Maiden Castle after the Iron Age Hillfort, after its golden age, doesn't it? And I guess also an insight into perhaps thinking about the Britons, the Celts who were living in that Roman town. Were they perhaps thinking back to a time when this was the centre of a very prominent, important Iron Age community, when the Hillfort was in its prime? Do you think there could have been great stories attached to Maiden Castle even in the late antique period?
I think there probably were, because if you didn't know who actually created it as an ancestral site, you would marvel at the engineering ability of whoever established this. So I think all kinds of myths and stories would have been attached to it. I mean, I think from my point of view, one of the interesting things about this particular site, we know that this temple was built about AD 360, and that's at a time when Christianity has become the state faith. So churches are what's being built around the empire, but not here. Here they're building a temple to older gods. So I think the link to land, the link to sort of the older sort of nature of gods and goddesses is much, much stronger here. And they're still quietly rejecting Christianity, but they're still, they are still honouring the old faith.
It's really funny, isn't it, that it's called Maiden Castle today, and yet there's no castle here. We don't really know what happened here during the medieval period, the age of the castle. In fact, if you come to Maiden Castle today, you're here for its incredible ancient and British prehistory.
Exactly.
Well, there you go, Maiden Castle, one of the jewels of Iron Age Britain. If you want to learn more about Britain's fascinating prehistory, then why not check out our ancient history podcast, The Ancients, where we cover all things from Boudica to Stone Age Shetland.